And I know that you've spoken about this sort of trend. You identify the emergency or invent an emergency, and then under those crisis conditions, you make the changes that you want. I know that you said that they got what they wanted out of this whole thing. Do you see that continuing so long as they have this pandemic? Are we likely to see it used behind the scenes, perhaps, by the Trump administration to continue the sorts of policies that they want?
So in this instance, the Trump administration was to dismantle the asylum system. But in other contexts, the U.S. state continues to separate families and children. We have in 50 states a system where if you are arrested, if you go to prison, if you test positive for drugs, then you're going to lose your children, or you're at high risk of losing your children into a foster care system. And as we look at the street protests calling for racial justice and freedom from violence against the police, we have to be really careful that people don't use the calls to defund the police to strengthen other kinds of state coercive systems, right? Every time I hear somebody say, oh, we're sending the police in all sorts of circumstances when we could send somebody else. Like, why don't we send a medical professional if somebody is overdosing from drugs? Or why don't we send a social worker to any number of these situations? And my heart just sinks because we know also what social workers do when they go to families who are in crisis, that we have a 100-year history of them taking children from impoverished families.
Well, that I have to admit that is both very interesting, and I hadn't thought about that as a potential consequence of shifting some of the responsibilities from police to these other the people that we think of as at least less likely to bring lethal force to bear in these interactions. But so I want to pursue that. If we do shift to sending, for instance, more social workers, is there something fundamental to the way they've been trained that leads to these separations? Is it a directive from up above? Basically, is there a way that we could reform that process to avoid some of the potential violence of the police, but make sure that we're not continuing this pattern of separating families needlessly and in a discriminatory fashion based on class or race?
Right. I think we have to rethink what we're doing with the child welfare system. You made reference to the problem that we talk a lot about saving children from difficult situations as a strategy for protecting the innocent children. And I think we need to have a serious conversation that I really only heard in this country for the first time in 2018, which is, should we be putting kids in foster care when the only crime that their family has committed is being poor? And so overwhelmingly, those are the reasons kids enter foster care. It's a housing crisis. It's a food crisis. We think of it as having something to do with violence or abuse, but that's a tiny minority of the cases in which we take children. And I think that just as we've started saying we need to really be paying attention to the conditions under which the police get involved in anything, we need to really look at the conditions under which the state gets involved in families and households.
You know, when I sort of the confluence of a few different things that we're talking about here, about the renewed national focus, at least over the past few years, of family separation, of the pandemic conditions that have already been tied into American immigration policy, if not explicitly, you're identifying how it is being used by the Trump administration, as well as the renewed focus on racial inequalities, longstanding structural racial inequalities. I also know that there is, at least on the horizon, the idea that hypothetically some sort of immigration reform could be coming. Considering all of that context, we don't know exactly how the election is going to shake out, but it looks like it's likely to be either Trump or Biden. What are your thoughts about the possibility of reform and considering those things, the welfare of children? How is that likely to affect them in the medium term?
Well, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that both Democratic and Republican administrations have thought that they knew best in terms of where families belong or whether it was okay to take children from families. So you talk about the COVID crisis. Here's a context. An Albuquerque hospital has been looking at the zip codes of mothers who are delivering. And if it matches them up with pueblos, if they're assumed to be from an indigenous community, they've been taking those newborns and keeping them away from the women who give birth to them until those mothers can be tested for COVID, on the theory that they might be infectious. And so what we have is unnecessary testing in pueblos where there isn't even a COVID hotspot. What we have again and again is the idea that white folks know better than people of color about how best to care for their communities and how best to care for their children.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
well, feel free to continue.
And in terms of what can we expect from a Biden administration, certainly if we were to have a Biden administration, we can expect that the context would be better for immigrants and refugees than it currently is under the Trump administration, right? Trump ran on a policy of stopping immigrants at the border, even if his administration has been really explicit that they don't even believe that there's such a thing as refugees, and that the asylum system is just basically a way for illegal immigrants to slip into the country. On the other hand, the Biden administration was part of several of the initiatives in the Obama administration that were really bad for kids and immigrant and refugee kids. So the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle, which takes in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the countries from which there was a exodus of refugee children in 2014, Obama was part of pushing those kids out through an expedited removal process, which is to say they didn't get hearings on whether they had a reasonable fear of persecution if they returned to their countries. And we know, because people documented it, that some of those kids died when the Obama administration returned. We also know that in 2009, the State Department under Hillary Clinton wound up supporting a coup in Honduras that resulted in death squads in the streets again in Honduras. So the United States has played a significant role in the weakening of states and local governments throughout the Central America region that's allowed cartels to take control of local government, the police, and the military, which are the conditions under which people began to flee in 2014, continuing to the present.
Yeah. So not necessarily a very optimistic outlook, regardless of which way it goes. But we appreciate you, filling us in on some of what's likely to come. Laura Briggs, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. The book is Taking Children: A History of American Terror. And we very much appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.